Hindol, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me here.
Okay, start off by telling us a little about your background and your career and what you're doing today.
So I was actually trained as a journalist and a filmmaker in India. And then I worked in television for some time. I used to work for CNBC and then CNN and then Bloomberg TV, where I hosted my own political interview show. And then I did the reverse switch. I mean, usually people go from print to television. I moved from television to print. I joined Fortune, where I've been for the last 5 years. I'm editor-at-large for Fortune in India, which means I write across sectors. And I have written now 5 books. Incidentally, the first 2 books I wrote were about textile heritage and luxury and fashion and the history of fashion for India, which finally became textbooks that are taught in Indian colleges, like NIFT, which is India's biggest fashion college. So they've all got incorporated and where I've lectured. Then I went on to write, and basically I write about politics and economics. So for the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years, I have focused on looking at India's experience of opening up its markets, of liberalization, what is known as economic liberalization. And I wrote a book which looked at a personal history of the liberalization process for about 2 decades. Then I wrote a book about Indian elections and the issues around which elections are fought and won and lost in India. And now, of course, I wrote a book called Recasting India, which tries to explain that there is inherently, like there is an American dream, there is also an Indian dream. It's just that it's not often spoken about in those terms around the world.
What is the central idea of your new book?
So the central idea of my new book is that there is an Indian dream. What do I mean by that? Look, the American dream talks about how anybody can make it to the top, right? They just have to have a big idea and work hard for it. The Indian dream is essentially about this. The Indian structure of the state was built on this edifice where there was a very large bottom and middle and a very small elite at the top. And that structure got demolished in the last 25 years of economic liberalization as opportunities for people to access anything from education to goods and services really expanded. So the middle really expanded, but the bottom also expanded. But when you talk about India, outside India especially, there are 2 stories of India, 2 ideas of India that come out, right? One, of course, is the idea of a socialist India, which says, the state did this or state didn't do this and so on and so forth, which is a very Nehruvian idea. The first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru believed in socialism, and that's one of the ideas. The other idea that's spoken about a little more these days in the last 10 years is this idea of large Indian companies. So you would have the Tatas and the Ambanis and so on and so forth. India's IT sector talked about a lot in America. But there is a third and equally powerful, if not more powerful idea, which my book talks about, which is the quote-unquote informal sector, or literally millions and millions of entrepreneurs who've got an enormous opportunity to rise to the top in the last 25 years. The informal sector, if you look at data, contributes about 50% of India's GDP, and it's basically a revolution fueled by entrepreneurs. So the central idea of my book is, people keep asking, where is the Arab Spring in India? Where is the Indian Spring, so to speak? And I say, these revolutions are happening every day. Naipaul said 1 million mutinies now, right? Those 1 million mutinies are happening in India every single day as millions of entrepreneurs fuel goods and services and ideas that make life just a wee bit little better for their customers, right? And it's a bottom-up, grounds-up revolution which very few people understand outside India. That, to me, is the Indian dream. Mm-hmm. If it weren't for this bottom-up revolution, there would be far more violence against the state in India. Because, look, I talk about this concept called per capita hope, and I say, it's not just that people got more things, they did go and get more things, but what's the big difference between my parents' generation and my generation? My parents never dared to even dream that they would get X, Y, Z, right? Whereas my generation, and maybe people slightly older and slightly younger than me, realized and got this opportunity to dream that anything was possible, right? The per capita hope rose in the country. So you have to understand, it's not just that people got something, but more importantly, they got the opportunity to think in their heads that if I really work hard towards this, I will get it. That's not the India that used to exist in the past.
Your last 3 books have focused on issues around politics, economy, social change, enterprise within India. Why is it that you've decided to focus on these issues?
Well, because I am a product of those change. The only reason I write about the issues that I write about is because they intimately affect my life. I mean, I believe what I really write, and which is my sort of core strength, is the personal narrative, right? I basically focus on how there are two ways of looking at history. One is the macro picture, the other is where you take the intimate micro picture. And of course, sometimes you focus really on your own life and your own self to tell a larger story about the macro picture. So you take the intimate details and connect it to the larger story, which is what I do. That's my way of talking about history, right? And I believe that's interesting for me to explore because, look, I'm the first generation in my family who was educated in the English language. So it is really interesting to me that somebody like me in my early 30s, I can look at the journey that I have overcome, right? And if that isn't the Indian dream, I don't know what is, right? That today somebody like me can be in New York and talk at the Harvard Club is something that most Indians would never dream of at one point, right? So we have finally come to an India where the opportunity to dream and try and make it happen is the seminal driving force of the country. That does not in any shape or form mean that things are not going wrong in India. Of course, many things are going wrong. Of course, we have millions of poor people. I mean, who can deny that? But the driving force of India today is this anticipation of a better life. And that is the central theme of my work and literally my life's work, because I'm a product of that. You can only write about things that you understand the best, right? And this is what I understand the best.
Who would you say is the target audience for your book?
I think the target audience for my book is anybody around the world who wants to understand a different vision of India. Some of the Western media's coverage of India, I'm frankly, almost laughing sometimes because, it's basically elephants and snake charmers with new terminology. Some of the biggest organizations in the West would pick up the most exotic stories about India. So let me give you one example. I started a not-for-profit which did the first ever urban gender mapping in India, and we built one of the world's first women's safety mobile apps, right? We got written about in the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on and so forth. But here's the interesting thing. It's not that India doesn't have gender violence. It does, and patriarchy is being fought in India. But in the West, it's always the story of a gruesome rape that will get maximum coverage. But the millions and millions of people fighting gender violence across India does not and perhaps will not get the coverage that it deserves. The biggest truth about gender in India today is never before in the history, in 3,000 years of Indian history, has patriarchy been fought more powerfully every day by really empowered young and old women than ever before in India's history. Those stories are never told because they don't make exotic reading. What makes exotic reading is, one woman got gang raped, and that's a terrible thing, and there's no denying that. People tell me, why does the West write about Slumdog Millionaire? Because we have slums, there's no denying that, right? But it's equally true, and that's where my work focuses, it's equally true that never before in India's history have women fought a greater battle against patriarchy than they fight today. Who's going to tell that story? It's my humble effort. I mean, will the world listen? We shall see.
Tell us a little bit about how this entrepreneurial culture is forming at a deeper base within India.
Look, India was always entrepreneurial. If you look at the golden years of Indian history, you look at any example. I mean, you read Angus Maddison, the British historian, right, where India has about a fifth of world GDP. Some of the back in the day, Pliny the Elder, the Roman historian, is writing that, India is finishing the great wealth of the Roman Empire. Why? Because Rome cannot get enough of the silks and the spices and so on and so forth, right? So India was always a trading power. India was always an entrepreneurial power, literally. And this is the really interesting thing. And Angus Maddison talks about this. India has about a fifth of the world GDP. In 1857, India loses the first war of independence against the British, right? Which in Britain would be called the first war of mutiny, the first mutiny against the British, right? The power shifts from the East India Company to the British Crown. And literally from 1857 to 1900, India's share of world GDP collapses to about a couple of percentage points of global GDP, right? What happens? Ambedkar talks about this. The great reformer B.R. Ambedkar, who wrote India's constitution, talks about this. Essentially, the British Crown destroys through terrible taxes and levies and economic controls the entrepreneurial power of India, from its textile industry to its handicrafts industry to its shipbuilding industry. Everything is destroyed. Colonialism destroys India. India was always an entrepreneur. This idea that India is a state-driven country is a really modern idea. It's a post-1947 idea. That's not what India has ever been. You look at 2,500 years of Indian history. India has always been a country that produced wonderful things, right? And we've forgotten that legacy. We've destroyed and forgotten that legacy. And I talk about it because finally, when the economy opened again, the natural entrepreneurial genius of India is coming to the forefront. But the state has impeded that genius at every level. Do we have good infrastructure? No, we have one of the worst infrastructure in the world. Of course, but I must say, we have a better tube system now in Delhi than you have in New York, but that's only because ours is an only 10-year-old system. But we just have not been able to build the kind of infrastructure, and the state has refused to get out of the way. The state impedes entrepreneurs at every level. But even then, this entrepreneurial energy of India has never before been stronger. So there is a new wave of entrepreneurs. And look, what is enterprise? I mean, that's the other question that my work tries to answer. I think around the world, including in America, our understanding of what is entrepreneurship is also changing. Entrepreneurship traditionally has always been seen through a business school kind of model, which tells you entrepreneurship is essentially return on investment. Essentially, you put in $1, you get X amount, $1 plus back. If you're not doing that, you're not a good businessman, right? And I argue that that's true, but around the world, a different model, a different, more sustainable model is coming in, which is an entrepreneur is first somebody who finds solutions to problems in their ecosystem. And those have to be sustainable solutions. So of course you have to make money, right? Otherwise it's not sustainable. But the pure profit motive is inherently a detrimental motive, where you're only saying, I don't care what happens to the ecosystem, I don't care what happens to my employees, I don't care what happens to the world around me, I only will see my bottom line. It doesn't work anymore. We are seeing around the world it doesn't work. Happier employees are better for your bottom line. A good ecosystem, a sustainable ecosystem is better for your bottom line. So I think what is happening in India, and I think India in that can show the way, is and my book talks about these people. They're showing how you can find, all these Indian entrepreneurs are showing how you can find solutions to an ecosystem, right? To the problems in an ecosystem. So somebody says, okay, there is a problem of getting organized domestic labor. How can we, and there's exploitation there, how can we build an entrepreneurial model which will take away the idea of servants and bring in the idea of service, right? And that's one example. But there are many examples like this. And I think around the world, there is this idea that sustainable entrepreneurship can only be built if the focus is on solving problems. Because that's what entrepreneurship always was. At some point, we believed that financial jugglery was the sole motive of entrepreneurship. And we're sitting in New York, so I guess it's important to talk about that. I mean, Warren Buffett just talks about it in the letter that he wrote, right? So this whole finance-driven and hedge fund-driven sort of idea of entrepreneurship is an extremely poisonous one. I think the core idea of entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurship that built America, the entrepreneurship that thrived in India and made it what it used to be in its heydays, right, is an idea of entrepreneurship that if there is a problem in the ecosystem, an entrepreneur goes out there and solves it. And I think we need to reinvent that idea.
How can India do a better job on capitalizing on the talent that's there?
The most simple solution to solving some social injustice in India is get everybody to learn the English language. Because the language itself becomes a barrier and exploitative form of injustice against people. I know the language, you don't know the language, so I will exploit you, right? That's a social hierarchy that gets created immediately. So I completely disagree with Indian politicians who, for their own selfish purposes, say, no, language chauvinism and language nationalism. I don't believe that's true. That's one straight way. Bring people the language. Do you know, for instance, in India, some of the biggest people supporting the English language and spread of the language is the Dalit community, the most oppressed communities. I write about this in my book, right? The organized Dalit community actually has a day every year where they worship the goddess English, because it's an incredibly empowering tool. Because with that, if you know English, like Baba Saheb Ambedkar, B.R. Ambedkar, who wrote the Indian Constitution, he knew English, right? And he had been, he studied in Columbia, and he got access to that kind of education. It immediately breaks down those barriers. So one way that India can actually tap into this energy and source is get people English, get people infrastructure. 300 million Indians still don't have electricity. And if you think it'll only come from burning more coal, it won't. We have to develop more sustainable ways of getting energy, right? Water. Large parts of India faces one of the most biggest crises of water, and you'll see water wars happening in India in the next 10 years. So unless those basic things are solved, you cannot have an entrepreneur who doesn't have roads, doesn't have electricity, doesn't have water. I mean, how will that entrepreneurial talent come up? So language, infrastructure, and finally, the last thing that I would say that you really need to tap into this, the state should get out of the way. In India, at least, the state causes more problems by being there. The state needs to get out of the way. Put a system in place which is simple, which is efficient, which anybody can monitor, and ideally it should be online. It should be a digital process. The more there is human interface in India, the more there is corruption. Get the human interface out, there will be less corruption. It's a no-brainer, right? So yeah, if these 3 or 4 things are done, it would be very helpful.
China is far ahead of India in terms of its development. How do you think it could catch up?
This is, again, this whole race business is a construct of certain parts of essentially Western media. I don't think we're in a race with China. I don't think we need to be in a race with China. They have a very different model. They have a very different country. Their politics is very different, and they will solve the problems that they have. India has very different problems, and India should solve it. Look, at the end of the day, even if it's a race, how does it matter if China is growing at 7% and we are growing at 8%, right? It doesn't matter unless we're taking that 8% growth and solving the problems on the ground, that more people have healthcare than ever before, less children die of malnutrition than ever before, more toilets are built than ever before, our infrastructure becomes better, our air is cleaner. But in this competition today, I mean, Delhi air pollution is worse than Beijing and Shanghai. So now, should we feel happy? I mean, what difference does it make? So this, I mean, I'm not a big fan of this, this competition theory. It doesn't mean anything, I mean, And funnily enough, look, when America, and this is an interesting thing that I've often thought, when America slowly began to become the world's most prosperous and most competitive country, I mean, was the debate always about whether it's beating the UK? No. So, I mean, why is the debate in Asia always about India versus China and who's beating who? It doesn't matter. We have to do what we need to do and solve our problems.
Mm-hmm. What would you say are some of India's strengths and some of its biggest challenges?
I think the biggest seminal challenge that India has, and I don't think it'll go away in a hurry, is that essentially India still believes that it is a government that has a country, that it's a state-led system. And that idea needs to be flushed out. It is getting flushed out because, look, we were a civilization far before we became a nation state. So India has civilizational virtues which are 3,000 years old. And that is what makes India. The idea that this nation state makes India is nonsense. The nation state is only, 60 something years old. So that is the biggest challenge. The state has to get out of the way. That does not in any way mean, and I talk about this in my book, that the state does not have a really important role in providing infrastructure, in bringing social justice, in applying law and order. All of that is really, really important. But the state has to get out of this. I mean, look, the Indian state is still running companies, including a watch company. It's ridiculous that the Indian state is still involved in all sorts of nonsense, right? The state needs to get out of the way and empower individuals. Look, the seminal problem of India is the modern Indian state was built on this idea that the government was the key thing. Whereas in America, it's always the individual that has been the key thing. And I think that's the right way for India to develop, because that's who we were. We were always a nation where individual and individual enterprise was really held up and celebrated. We forgot all that. So we have to go back to this idea that the individual is the most powerful, sort of idea. And what are its strengths? I think India's greatest strength, therefore, let me say, are the individuals. Because, there's this whole thing about India grows at night when the government is asleep. I mean, this I mentioned this in my book too. The great Indian IT sector that everybody talks about, the information technology sector, there's this whole joke which has gone on for many years that it happened in Bangalore, far away from Delhi. So now the politicians got to know. And that's why the information technology sector boomed. Because had the government got to know that they were doing these cool things, immediately everything would have stopped, right? So yeah, I'm a big believer that India's inherent strength lies in its people, its inherent entrepreneurial tendencies that people have within themselves, and that just needs more opportunities.
Do you think it's a good time for those who might be interested in starting a business, maybe foreigners who are interested in starting a business in India? Do you think it's a good time for them to set up shop there, to take advantage of the talent pool there? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think it's never been a better time to look at India. But you can't arrive in India with rose-tinted glasses. And for two reasons, and if I may be blunt, for two reasons. Number one, a lot of people still arrive in India thinking that, oh, we're from the West, so let us go and teach the East, or let us teach the developing countries how to do things. That doesn't work anymore. That sort of intellectual condescension or economic condescension just does not work. If you go with that idea to India, you're bound to get disappointed. You have to go with some degree of humility. You have to go with this understanding that you don't understand the ecosystem. And there's not much you can teach there. You can teach some things, but that's also, reverse innovation. You will bring some technologies or some ideas, and those ideas will also, alter on the ground. Look, every company that thinks, including, if I may name a company, the latest Uber, which got into trouble in India, if you go in thinking that you will just pluck a business model from America and you will just play it in India and it'll work beautifully, 99.99% of the time it won't. You have to understand it's a whole new ecosystem. You might have a good business idea and a good plan and a good technology. That will have to adapt itself to a whole new ecosystem, right? And adaptability is the key. So yes, it has never been a better time to be in India and do business in India, but that's only true if you have adaptability. If you think of your ideas as plug and play, it's not going to work.
Your book also talks about how historically business and entrepreneurs were able to come together and better collaborate to push social reform.
Sure.
And in modern India, there's a deep disconnect between business, entrepreneurs, politics, social change. Tell us more about that.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been exploring, and I'll continue to explore in new books that I'm writing, is look, if you look at Indian history, this idea that entrepreneurs drove social change has always been true. Let me give you an example, which I cite in the book also. Everybody talks about Rabindranath Tagore, who was the first Nobel laureate out of India, but we've forgotten his ancestor, Dwarkanath Tagore, who's the man who almost brought the Industrial Revolution to the banks of the Hooghly in Calcutta, right? And here is a man who was so wealthy that he got the epithet Prince. So he was called Prince Dwarkanath Tagore, right? He owned banks and factories and this, that, and the other. Enormously wealthy man. But this is also a man whose legacy is intimately, revered in India because he fought against the heinous practice of sati, in which a woman was burnt alive in the funeral pyre of her dead husband, right? Which was a social evil in India, and which was never there in Hinduism. It had been brought by, sort of essentially corrupt Brahminical culture at some point in the medieval period. And this was not, if you go in Hinduism, there's no mention of sati, right? This had been brought in, right? And he really fought against it and pushed the British to get this out and outlaw it. And, there's no sati in India today. There hasn't been in 100 years. Why? Because they fought against this. This is just one example. There's example after example of entrepreneurs who've really used their social clout, their money to push social reform, right? And we've forgotten, because post-1947, all capitalism began to be seen as, wrong or corrupt or evil. This synergy got destroyed. Look at Gandhi. Gandhi doesn't believe capitalism is inherently, or the profit motive is, or business is inherently bad at all. If he did, one of his closest friends wouldn't be the Birla Group in India, which is one of India's biggest conglomerates, right? And in fact, Gandhi was killed. The house in which he was killed is a Birla house, right? Which was later converted into a national mausoleum. So Gandhi understands the balance, and he talks about this theory of trusteeship, where he believes that, people who are wealthy should hold that money, almost as a trust for the people, because society finally allows them to make the money. So Gandhi understands this balance. But subsequent governments in India after independence didn't understand this balance. And I think therein lies the problem. And we have to revive and reinvent this idea that it is not doing business that's a problem. It is how you do business that's a problem, right? And in order to thrive in business, you have to build businesses that are sustainable, that take care of the people who work for them, that take care of the ecosystem, the environment, right? And this mutual trust building between government and business, a process that's only now starting to happen in India, must go further. Because look, India can only change with state and private enterprise coming together. As long as there's inherent difference between the two and lack of trust between the two, India will not grow. So it's another idea that we're trying to relook at and reinvigorate.
The village economy you talk about in your book makes up 68% of the population and contributes some 50% to the GDP. And that's also set to poise or get much bigger over the next 5 years. Tell us about what that means for the Indian economy, for Indian politics, for social change.
So the village economy does not provide 50%. It's what we call the informal economy, which also includes a lot of informal, unregistered businesses, right? So not just people working in farms, but people working in a number of businesses, right? Which could be services, which could be small-scale manufacturing, all sorts of things, right? That is already powering the Indian economy and will power much more in the future. But let me give you one example of why this informal economy is really, really important. Not only has this sector of the economy grown the fastest, as in these businesses put together have grown much faster than the large Indian companies, another thing has happened. These businesses, right, have also, if you look at most of these businesses, they are owned by what we call lower castes in India. So there is a revolution of social justice that has happened via economic power in and through these businesses, right? That there's a whole revolution of people making more money and therefore fighting against social injustice that has been powered by this entire system, which is a transformative thing in India. Most Indian jobs, 80 to 90% of all Indian jobs are provided by the sector. It is the informal economy that provides 80 to 90% of all Indian jobs. The formal economy, the formal large incorporated companies only provide about 10-15% of Indian jobs. So most jobs also come from this sector, right? And this combination of providing the maximum number of jobs and the combination of pushing social justice via good economics is an incredibly powerful thing. And that is completely sweeping aside many old Indian prejudices of hierarchy, of class difference, caste difference, all sorts of things. Because it's really empowering people to demand for better lives from the ecosystem they live in, from the village and towns that they live in, from government. It's just the demand pull is so great that is changing things in India and will continue to in the future.
Tell us how innovative business models have helped drive entrepreneurship in Jammu and Kashmir.
Does anybody talk about Kashmir as an entrepreneurial place?
No.
Nobody talks about it.
It's been riddled in war with India and Pakistan for several years.
Right. So that's the only thing people talk about. President Clinton went to Kashmir and said it's the world's most, most unsafe place, most dangerous place. That's the only version of Kashmir we ever hear about, right? But do you know the Jammu and Kashmir Bank, which is almost entirely run by Kashmiris, is one of the best run and most profitable banks in the country? Nobody talks about this. It has one of the lowest rates of NPAs, which is non-performing assets. So essentially, in Jammu and Kashmir, the Jammu and Kashmir Bank, the loans that the Jammu and Kashmir Bank gives out, which is largely to Kashmiris, Kashmiris giving out loans to Kashmiris, because it's run also by Kashmiris. Almost all the loans that the bank gives out, the money comes back. So it is one of the lowest rates of non-performing assets, right? And it's one of the best run banks in the country. Why is this story not better known? That bank has been on the Fortune India 500 list for, last 5 years that Fortune has been in India. Why does nobody say that one of the best banks in India is out of Jammu and Kashmir? What does it say about that place, right? We don't talk about this. We don't talk about entrepreneur after entrepreneur who's doing marvelous work in Kashmir. There's this, in my book I talk about this lady called Ghazala Amin who's doing incredible things in horticulture in Kashmir, right? And there are story after story after story. But we have trapped, look, what has happened is India has got trapped in cliches. Kashmir equals violence. India equals snake charmers and elephants. Indian women equals violence and exploitation. Indian culture equals retrograde and rubbish. So it's all these cliches, these colonial cliches that are perpetuated, which is really annoying. People like me have devoted their lives in trying to change this, because we see what is happening. We see how our own country is changing, right? And we see the amount of, change that's happening every day. So Kashmir, do you know, for instance, the day, now that we're talking here today, one of the most revolutionary political things have ever in the history of India has happened in Kashmir, where the ruling BJP, who rules the center, and another party which once used to support separatists or militants in Kashmir called PDP, have come together to form a government in Kashmir, which was unheard of. Nobody would have told you even 6 months ago this could happen. It's mind-blowing. But when you read some of the newspapers, it makes no sense. So my urging of my work is, including with Kashmir, and especially with Kashmir, please go and see what's happening there. Something really miraculous is happening there. I'm not saying, please don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying there aren't problems. Of course there are problems. Who can deny that there are problems, right? Of course there are problems. But beyond the problems, there are many other things also that are happening, right? Kashmir has had year after year, election after election, peaceful elections with record turnouts. So tell me, if everybody, all the Kashmiris are so violent and they all hate India so much and so on and so forth, why are record numbers of people going out and voting in an Indian election? So what is happening there? There's a mismatch between the two stories we're trying to tell, right? So therein comes my effort to talk about things like the Jammu and Kashmir Bank, things like Ghazala Amin, the horticultural entrepreneur, and so on and so forth, right? To say that, look, there are different lenses that we should look at things.
Some examples of how lending to the poor can be a sustainable, socially useful, and a profitable business. What's the key to making this happen?
So this informal sector that we're talking about, one of the biggest problems is, even though all these millions of entrepreneurs have done such exciting work, their financial support from organized finance is miserable. 4%, maybe 5% of total bank lending goes to them. It's ridiculous. So one of the key things that these entrepreneurs need, as entrepreneurs everywhere need, is better access to finance at the right price, at a low cost, right? But the infrastructure and the state and its arms in India have never been able to give the, essentially the financial support to these entrepreneurs, whereas they can lend money and use it whatever way they want to use it, right? And if that happens, and there is push now to make that happen, if that happens, another miraculous thing will happen in India, because you will see businesses gain scale, employ more people, do transformative things. Imagine if it brings in half of India's GDP with less than 10% of lending, what could it do if you just double the lending? And around the world, there are examples of this. In Malaysia, over a period of time, in a structured manner, they said that we will ensure that greater financial lending support goes to organizations and businesses which are run or which directly impact socially disadvantaged groups, right? And over a 20-year period, that's what Malaysia did, which had a transformative impact on their economy. Especially in India, where this informal sector has such a large number of entrepreneurs and people working in it, which come from socially disadvantaged sectors, if you actually are able to give financial support and better lending processes to them, where more money goes into their hands, it'll have a transformative impact. And that's an idea I'm really trying to push, saying that, this is one thing we must do. And it seems, now the government has just announced a new bank called the Mudra Bank, which will target this kind of lending, which hopefully we shall see whether it works or not, but it's a very interesting idea.
Yeah. You also talk about a company called the Maids Company.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories in the book.
Yes,
yeah, sure.
And that helps employ poor women as domestic help, but
That's right.
also gives them partial ownership into the company,
Yes.
something that's rarely seen.
That's right.
How has the owner actually made this happen? What are
Yeah.
some of the things that she's done, and what have been some of the outcomes of that?
I think the owner, this lady called Gauri Singh, had a really good idea, which is she said that Indians need domestic labor. Domestic labor is one of the safest places for women from underprivileged backgrounds in India to work at. Because otherwise, if women are sent to work in either factories or say, which often happens, real estate sites, right? Like building locations, right? The labor is really hard, right? Often it interferes with the sort of social goals that the woman might have, including bearing a child and so on and so forth. The exploitation is huge, right? In fact, working domestically is one of the safest environments because you can structure the work, you can expand and contract the working hours and so on and so forth, right? But there was exploitation there too, right? So how do you challenge that? And she had this wonderful idea where she said, look, it'll only work in the future if you stop thinking of domestic labor as servants. You have to think of domestic labor as service. So what does she do? She created this entire organization where she said, look, I don't provide any servants. You want a well-run household, and being, working couples and so on and so forth, you don't have the time to run it yourself. I will provide you trained employees who will work like employees. So they will not, number one, they will not work 24/7, right? They will not work without a break. They will not work infinite number of hours. They won't stay with you and pop up whenever you want them. They will come and do X number of tasks whenever and are stipulated in the contract, right? So what used to happen in India is your quote-unquote servant would do everything. Your servant would take care of the young child also, walk the dog also, water the plants also, cook your food also. She said that's rubbish, because if you want trained labor, those people are trained for a particular thing, right? So cook is a trained cook. You can't then say, oh, the cook will come and they will, take care of the child also. Because a trained nanny is a trained nanny. That's what the nanny has been trained for. So she created this wonderful company which breaks all these things up. And the place that she does it is a place called Gurgaon, which is this new township that's come out in the last 10, 15 years in India, where most people working there are, urban, middle-class people, usually, both the people in the home, the man and the woman, they're both working, they don't have time, so on and so forth. And she provides employees who go, they're trained, they do specific tasks for X number of hours every day. They have very fixed sort of working services and contracts, which is they have to have either Saturday or Sunday off. They will not work beyond a particular time. If you buy a service pattern which says they will only work for 2 hours, they will only work for 2 hours. You cannot ask them to stay back. And it's beautiful. It's the future. You look at that model and you're like, this is the future, right? Because you can't have a system where your servants are there for you all the time. That's rubbish. They have a personal life, right? And when you deprive them of their personal life, that's when you have a problem, because you're essentially depriving a whole bunch of people from having any personal aspiration because they're in service to you, right? That shouldn't be the case. There's a wonderful thing she says, and I want to mention this. She said, when women come to work with us and after they work with us for some time, their spine straightens. So she said, usually these women from very poor backgrounds and, often in exploitative relationships with patriarchy are so used to being beaten into subservience that almost physically their posture becomes bent. When you finally give them empowered, training, and you give them financial responsibility and financial freedom, slowly by slowly they learned to give it back, right? And as they learn to give it back, their spine straightens. So literally it's like a physical posture of somebody straightening. What a beautiful imagery that is. It's the greatest example of modern India and what modern India is. It's a country slowly straightening its spine after many years of global subservience. So to me, that's an incredible idea, and I was delighted to write about that story because if that doesn't define the Indian dream, I don't know what does.
Do you also feel that the next Apple or the next Samsung or the next Microsoft is not going to be coming out of India?
No.
Why is that?
Because I think for the next really large path-breaking corporation to come out of India, a lot of infrastructural change, both in the mind and physically on the ground, needs to change. Because we are just not thinking enough about innovation in India at the moment. We are thinking of solutions, and we are thinking of arbitrage, which is demand-supply mismatch and people making money out of that. But we are not thinking enough about big transformative changes, right? But that needs an ecosystem. Look, even in America, there's only one Silicon Valley. You know what I mean? In fact, around the world, there is only one Silicon Valley, right? I mean, something about that ecosystem creates these big ideas, right? India needs to find those ideas. And I really believe those ideas will necessarily not come if we keep looking at Apple and Microsoft and whatever. We have to find solutions to other problems and make them big ideas. One of the things that my foundation worked on intensively was one of the first women's safety mobile apps in the world, right? An SOS application which women could use in Delhi and so on and so forth. And I think we can turn our problems into solutions. Like, for instance, because we have large problems of air pollution, India should be at the cutting edge of path-breaking research on how to fix air pollution, right? Because we have water scarcity, we should be at the cutting edge of research on how does one conserve water better. So I think those are the sort of companies that should and ought to and perhaps will come out of India. They will be solution companies, right? Whereas an Apple and a Microsoft and so on and so forth, I mean, they have taken basically human imagination to a different level in a different sort of way, as in they've tried to show us how life could become better. Whereas I think the big ideas that will come from India perhaps will show us how life or the life's problems as they exist today, not sometime in the distant future, the problems that exist today can be solved effectively, more efficiently today, right? And those are the sort of large corporates perhaps India will create. But look, at the end of the day, maybe India does not need to create large corporates. Maybe there'll be 1 million small ideas that will come together and have a scale of their own of entrepreneurship. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely feel that the next Apple is not coming from India. We just do not have that level of cutting edge innovation in India at the moment. You need a different kind of infrastructure.
Tell us about how those at the very bottom of the pyramid, those who are considered the lowest castes of society, have used entrepreneurship to fight the odds against them economically, socially, and politically.
Large number of companies and firms not only are owned by lower caste people, but also have employees who come from lower caste. There's been a wonderful path-breaking research in this, which shows in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, which is a North Indian state, and a very large state at that, 2 parts of Uttar Pradesh, on how economics changes caste, right? So one of the biggest parts of caste discrimination is if I'm lower caste, which is a birth-based, sort of discrimination. It has nothing to do with anything else. If you're born lower caste, you're lower caste, right? 2 things changes. If I'm lower caste, traditionally one of the worst kind of discrimination is, and if you're upper caste, you wouldn't accept food from my hand or water from my hand. Anything that I touch, you will not touch, right? That's one of the biggest problems. This research showed that after 20 years of economic liberalization, one of the biggest things that began to happen is that barrier broke down. More and more quote-unquote upper caste people would readily accept food and drink from the hands of somebody lower caste. In fact, somebody tells me this wonderful story in the book, and I want to repeat that. Pizza delivery ka koi jaat nahi hota, which means pizza delivery has no caste, right? What do they mean by that? Think about this, right? Let me paint a scenario for you. Say I'm a poor lower caste boy from an Indian village, and I've always seen discrimination. For maybe 1,000 years, I've only seen discrimination, right? Then one day the economy booms, right? I don't know a world outside my district or my village, but suddenly I have an opportunity to come to the city, I have an opportunity to make a different life, right? I go to some schools and I pick up a little bit of English and so on and so forth, and one of the jobs that I get is that of a pizza delivery person, right? And like millions of young people around the world, one of my first jobs is delivering pizza. So in this new economy of India, in a city, this village lower caste boy takes pizza, goes up to a home, and the doorbell rings and somebody opens without even thinking for a microsecond or even asking him what his caste is, what his name is, anything. They pay the money and take food from their hand. And in that moment, the dreams of Adam Smith and Ambedkar come together. You know what I mean? The great social reformer B.R. Ambedkar in India, and of course, Adam Smith's wonderful invisible hand of the markets, right? They come together in a magical way, but think about it, in the head of that boy, magic happens. I don't think any of us can ever understand what happens in that mind. It's impossible for you and me to understand what happens in that mind. Because that boy has never seen ever that somebody can unthinkingly take food and drink from his hand. For 1,000 years, nobody has ever thought of that in his family. And in a magical moment, it's true. So that is the power of economics. And that's the Indian dream. So what is writing a book in English and publishing it in the Western world for me is for that poor boy or that village boy, the idea of somebody accepting food from their hand. You have to be in India and understand India to really understand this. It's all very well to sit in Paris and London and New York and write pontificating, condescending editorials about India. But there is magic of economics happening in India. And I don't think people understand that. And, people like me are trying our best to sort of explain that. So, you asked me what happens in this lower caste. That's what happens. It breaks all barriers.
Why is it that so many people in India, at all rungs of society, from the very bottom of the pyramid throughout, turn to or are choosing to become entrepreneurs? What do you think it is?
So there are two reasons for this, right? One is, of course, there's a large number of people who don't have a choice. Like, for instance, a lot of the lower caste people, they can't get jobs, right? So what do? Entrepreneurship is a natural thing, right? I mean, it's entrepreneurship, of course, almost not of choice, but of compulsion, right? That's one. The other is, there's opportunity. People are realizing, I don't want to live. I mean, there's a social churn that's happening in India, Look, if I had to do what my parents and my grandparents and their parents did, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I would be government officer, grade 3, somewhere in some whatever, Mufassal, right? Because that's what, my whole family has ever done, right? So there's a whole aspiration to do other things with our lives, right? Make our lives count, right? And that's the power of India. So entrepreneurship is the avenue to two things. One is it's an avenue to social reform. The other is it's a natural avenue to make your life count in ways that earlier generations couldn't. So people would want more out of their lives. They're not happy just doing what their father or grandfather or mother or grandmother did, right? So those two things make entrepreneurship a natural choice.
One of the chapters in your book was called Facebook for the Poor and the Village Call Center, which was really a citizen-driven, citizen-empowered information network that bypasses traditional media, meant for those in tribes and villages. Tell us more about what that was about.
Oh yeah, I mean, these are both fascinating stories. I mean, there's a BBC journalist who essentially realizes that the whole edifice of Indian media, billions of dollars worth, large companies, whatever, operates again in these elite enclaves. So a water strike in Bombay will be headlines, whereas the universe might collapse in central India and tribal India, no one cares, right? So he's like, listen, this will exist as long as the people telling these stories come from the elite. It has to be people from there who are telling these stories. Look, even in Recasting India, why are my stories different from the stories that have been written by elite people in India and all these tomes that they have written? Because they don't know our stories, right? So I actually don't know the stories of the elite, so I can't tell those stories. So it's the tribals who have to tell the stories of their stories in the world, right? So he builds this wonderful network and called CG Swara, which basically is a mobile phone driven system where every day from various parts of central India, the tribals are telling each other their problems, their complaints, their music. It's like an ecosystem that's exchanging information about each other, which is incredibly powerful. I mean, hundreds and thousands of people use it. It's magical. The other, of course, is this idea of the village call center, which was started by, one of the stories in my book is started by this young engineer who realizes that, look, the information technology revolution is entirely urban in India. And even in urban, it's only about 2 or 3 cities. But what about the rest of India? Don't they deserve to get tapped into this information technology revolution? And says, I'm going to build it, right? And builds a village BPO. And again, I was talking about English here, magical. What essentially happens is they say, look, and say you're the client company. They go to the client company and say, look, you're willing to pay us $1,000, let's say. If I'm in a big Indian city, I will charge you $1,000, right? And you will get X amount of service for it. But I will not be in the city, and I'm telling you I won't be in the city. I will be in the smaller town or village, right? I will only charge you $800. But I will ensure to you that the service quality that you will get is perfect. So what they do is, obviously in that place, the cost of labor is much less, the cost of building infrastructure is much less. So they again bypass the whole government network and whatever, put up their own information lines, put up their own internet lines, telephone lines, whatever, train local people, give them education, speaking in English and so on and so forth, and run entire data centers and call centers from there. Which is amazing. I mean, because the IT revolution, as always, was entirely leaving a whole maximum part of India behind. But here are all these people, and one of those stories I've mentioned in my book, who are sort of building these new systems where the whole of India can get tapped in.
Right.
So essentially making even something like the information technology revolution a more egalitarian system where far more people can tap into it.
Great, Hindol. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
having me here. Thank you.